I think we'll kick this off now. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar discussion on fraud and identity risk. Today, we're going to focus on navigating the emerging threats and trends in digital fraud and preparing for the future. My name's Neil Forrest. I'm Head of Product Focused Sales and Consulting at Equifax. It's great to have you here today. Some quick housekeeping. Our running time for this session is around an hour. We're going to be dedicating the last 15 to 20 minutes to questions from our audience today. So feel free, please, anytime to pose a question using the Q&A facility. I think it's on the menu at the bottom of the window, and we'll aim to answer as many of your questions as we can. We're keen to ensure that this is a super valuable session for everybody. So we're going to try and keep the the jargon and fancy terminology to a minimum. To set the scene today, we're facing an unprecedented challenge as the volume and sophistication of fraud continues to increase. The CIFAS report, 13% increases in cases that have been filed within the National Fraud Database in 2024, which is the highest number on record. Equifax reported a total of £1.17 billion was stolen by fraudsters last year, largely as a result of the emerging sophistication of threats. So today we're privileged and delighted to have experts from Equifax, CIFAS and Equifax joining us today to help us better understand this evolving risk landscape. They'll be sharing key insights and exploring the steps organizations and industry could take to build a more dynamic and resilient defense against fraud. So first up, let's begin with a round of introductions from our guests. Ruth, Stephen, and Stephen, if you would kindly give us a quick introduction about yourselves and the organizations you're representing here today.
Thanks, Neil. I'm Ruth Ray. I'm Director of Fraud Policy and Operations at Equifax. Equifax represents the banking and financial services sector in the UK, and I head up sort of all the fraud remit for the organisation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Neil, for inviting us here today. My name's Stephen Dalton. I'm a Director of Intelligence at CIFAS. CIFAS is a not-for-profit organisation funded by its members. We host the UK's largest fraud risk database, the National Fraud Database, and we help our members across about 18, 19 different sectors, 700 members, to detect and prevent fraud. So really looking forward to the discussions today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Adams. I'm the Principal Fraud Consultant here at Equifax. I've been with Equifax about 8 months, but I've got 20 years client-side experience. So I'm ex-Admiral Insurance, ex-Confused.com, ex-RVU, and have come in as the Senior Fraud Consultant to be able to look and share with our clients all of our really interesting fraud products and fraud tools, and to support them in preventing fraud across all areas of the industries.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. In an attempt to avoid any confusion going forward, I'm going to refer to you as Stephen A and Stephen D, if that's okay with both of you.
No problem.
Fantastic. Excellent. Okay. Ruth, I'm going to turn to you first, if I may. Equifax reported £1.17 billion was stolen last year. So could you talk a little bit about the headline trends that are contributing to this figure?
Sure. So yeah, we recently published our latest fraud report, which has been really well received and hopefully provides an overview of how fraud is tracking in the financial services sector at the moment, and often makes for quite stark reading. Ultimately, that report has given us some interesting benchmarks, obviously from previous years, and the current trends are really stark. So we're looking at the moment that volume of fraud instances, so we can translate that as victims, are rising, but the values in many cases are actually decreasing. And we interpret this as meaning that criminals are having to work much harder for their gains due to, in a very large part, the efforts that are being taken by the industry to put in controls to protect their customers. We've certainly seen the industry is doing a pretty good job, and I think that's an understatement. 67p in every pound is actually saved and prevented, and that's up 20% on last year. So I think it needs to be called out. The level of investment by the industry in fraud prevention and detection measures is unprecedented. APP fraud, which, as most people know, is the authorized push payment fraud, where there's an awful amount of social engineering going on into convincing an innocent party to part with funds for a purpose that they aren't intending. That's down and continues to go, and we've seen a downwards trajectory over the last few years. But I think we feel very strongly that there's far more that should be done on the preventative side. The industry again stepped up to the mark late last year with the new regulation for mandatory reimbursement, which I don't think there's any doubt is very much supported. It's definitely a good thing to be refunding innocent customers and putting them back in the position they were in before they were defrauded. But we need to do far more on the prevention side, because tackling the problem all the way to the right-hand side is not sustainable. I think some of those figures around APP are largely around greater awareness and education. There's been some fantastic media attention to help people understand the threat that is being faced by so many people in terms of APP. And when we talk about APP, we're talking sort of romance scams, investment scams, impersonation, etc. But the reality as well is that APP and authorised fraud only accounts for a percentage of the problem here, and actually the far greater problem in terms of value is actually in the unauthorised fraud space. And while the industry was focusing so much attention on getting ready and accommodating the regulation coming in by the PSR last year, I think inevitably we've seen card fraud jump. And I think that's, again, in part, a level of distraction, all efforts being focused on ensuring, operational readiness for making sure customers were refunded. But also the evolving threat is moving incredibly fast. And so the minute we sort of push the balloon down in one place, it is inevitably popping up elsewhere. But the reality is nowadays that 70% of frauds originate online. And I think that's something we need to focus on. And indeed, 75% of frauds originate overseas. So this can't be something we just deal with in isolation domestically. This very much needs to be hand in hand on a cross-sectoral basis, and also very much in collaboration with our international partners in other jurisdictions. Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah, I think the collaboration and the cross-sector is something that we'll probably touch upon a bit later on. In the report, the concept of real-time data sharing was put forward. Can I ask if this is there a program underway to make this a reality, or what stage on that journey are we at?
So I think in general, there are lots of pockets of really good activity going on in terms of data and intelligence sharing across the ecosystem. And I think that does need calling out. I think there's an awful lot of passion and will behind trying to work more collaboratively and share data to try to have an impact on the problem. I think real-time data sharing in those pockets is feasible. And again, I think there are small amounts of those initiatives going on, but the reality is that that's not operating at any kind of scale at the moment. And that is our biggest problem, is that without sort of really robust systems leadership, bringing everyone in the ecosystem together, pulling in the same direction, sharing data and intelligence for a common purpose, with everyone playing their part reciprocally in terms of that data and intelligence sharing, we are going to be continuing to just pick at the problem without having a great impact. And I think that's what's been shown in our fraud report, is that, you know, there's a lot of organisations that are doing some good work, but not nearly at the scale that we need. It's not having an impact because fraud, in terms of the general numbers, is not going down. We are not making a dent in this problem. And so something pretty radical needs to change in order to move that dial.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one other thing to say, because often when you read these industry level reports, you get a sense of sort of, you know, the doom and gloom, you know, the size of the numbers in question. But I think you touched on it earlier. Whilst over $1 billion was lost to fraudsters, a further 1.4 billion was prevented. So it does feel like there is a good news story in there as well.
You're right. And you know, I'll take and celebrate any wins in this area, because again, there's so many organizations that are dedicating so much time and effort to try to combat this problem. I was speaking to one of our members just last week who shared that they, as an organisation, spend more on fraud prevention and detection than they do on their entire branch network. You know, this is phenomenal sums of money that are going into this, but this can't be in isolation. Our industry, obviously heavily regulated and for many reasons, but they've responded very well to the regulation that came in relation to APP last year. And as a result, have really invested incredibly heavily in making sure that the controls are as tight as possible, while also making sure that the sort of, you know, 95% of us who are banking, you know, sensibly, and not suggesting that victims aren't banking sensibly, by the way, by any stretch of the imagination, but those of us that are paying in and operating legitimately with our banking services can be uninterrupted, and that has to be the focus, making sure that your everyday customers can bank safely and efficiently. However, there is this small percentage that are taking advantage of areas where controls aren't quite so tight, or again, we haven't been able to respond as quickly to an evolving threat that's in front of us. So I think it's incredibly important to make sure that we do celebrate our wins, but we also be realistic about, you know, what is ahead of us and what opportunities we have to, one, ensure we send the deterrent message. We are collaborating. Fraudsters will find it difficult to target us in the UK, and I don't think that's probably the case now. And two, that we are actually having an impact and can work collectively with law enforcement again to make sure that those that are a centre of that see the effects on them and their lifestyles.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. Turning to you now, Stephen D, if I may. We mentioned at the start that CIFAS had reported a 13% increase in the fraud risk cases filed. So again, the highest on record. For any of us on the webinar who have not read the Fraudscape report, Stephen, I wonder if you could spend a few minutes covering some of the key points and trends that CIFAS are seeing.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that, Neil. I mean, first of all, just to sort of set that understanding, the Fraudscape report is an annual report produced by CIFAS on, and it's the analysis of the data that we hold within the National Fraud Database. I referenced earlier, it's the largest database of fraud risk in the UK. We've got over nearly 2 million cases filed to the database, and our categories that we seek to get from our members are identity fraud, which is obviously a key enabler in all sorts of other activities, misuse of facility, so misuse of that account or that product or service, account takeover, which is where the threat actor has taken over the account, and application fraud and first-party fraud. They're our sort of key sort of categories and represent the vast majority of our filings. So they're the ones I'll sort of comment on. And it's worth saying also that members who filed those cases to that database, that contributed to an estimated £2.1 billion worth of savings in fraud losses. So that is a good news story, but I agree with Ruth. This problem is so vast and so massive that whilst that sounds like a really great number, it probably represents a very small fraction of the total fraud losses to the UK. So in terms of onto the report, yes, this was our largest number of filings, a rise of 13%, which was It equates to about 46,000 additional cases. We had over 420,000 cases filed to the NFT in 2024. Nearly 250,000 of those were identity fraud cases, which is up 5%. And, you know, echoing what Ruth said about this being cyber enabled, 86% of those originated online, and that's obviously fueled by the availability of Gen AI technologies, giving criminals and also increasingly novice actors the tools to create high quality false documents and comms, emails and the like. Facility takeover, which was our second highest category, was 74,000 cases were filed. That's a huge increase of 76%, and that's fueled partly by a particular scam involving handsets, but also an increase in SIM swap activity. Phishing is still the most common method of taking control of existing accounts, and we know members are reporting lots of high quality spoof websites, brand impersonations, and things like that. There's also a prevalence of account takeover being facilitated by remote access technology, where fraudsters are placing malware into your system and then accessing your system remotely. And as I said, the SIM swap activity, where fraudsters are able to gain control of your products and services through mobile phones, and obviously obfuscating the protection provided by one-time passcodes, is also a significant concern. We've seen a massive increase in the reporting of that, over 1,000% increase, which is anomalous because we weren't getting many reports before, but that is corroborated by what the NCA are reporting in terms of the number of cases that are coming in. And the other one to mention, misuse of facility. We saw an increase there. That sort of vies with facility takeover in terms of second highest number of reports. That's kind of stayed fairly steady. We only had a 1% increase, but that's obviously a key enabler for people cashing out. And we also had 21,000 false applications. That was an increase of 10%. And again, fueled, we think, a lot by Gen AI, false documentations and economic pressures, but also our fraud behaviours research that we do every year suggests that nearly 48% of adults and an increasingly large number of younger people think it's reasonable to commit some form of first-party fraud. So there's things that we can do there, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail. But overall, what the report is saying is, fraud has become industrialised. AI and automation is making sophisticated attacks cheap and scalable, and there's absolutely more, as Ruth said, that we need to do.
When you talk to your members, Stephen, what are they saying are the biggest current challenges?
AI, Gen AI, keeping pace with AI-enabled deepfakes, the ability for it to produce synthetic identities, and automated bot attacks. So that's coming up regularly as a feature when we talk to members. Rapid fire account takeover, the SIM swap activity that I referenced earlier, which obviously bypasses that two-factor authentication in real time. Members also talk about the challenges of balancing really, good, strong fraud controls with friction-free customer experiences, and also then what the regulator is saying and what their expectations are as well. Those are sort of some of the key challenges. And echoing Ruth's earlier comment, I think there are some really good examples of good practice when it comes to intelligence and data sharing, and there is some emerging opportunities there, but there's still an issue in terms of it's far too fragmented, it takes too long, and there's still legal and data policy uncertainty around that activity as well, and that's something we need to focus on, I think.
One area that stood out for me in the report was the rise of the false application cases. You touched on this briefly a minute ago. So you've got the false documentation being a factor, and this growing social acceptance around first-party fraud. Do you see both of those trends as equally concerning? And I guess, what can we do to mitigate them?
Yes, I think they are concerning. I mean, but they pose different but equally serious sort of risks. I mean, let's not pretend that first-party fraud is new. I think it's been around for a long time. We might be getting slightly better at spotting some of that activity, or we might be creating more opportunities for first-party fraud. I think when it comes to first-party fraud, there's a cultural behavioural issue here that can be mitigated by behavioural analytics, providing more sort of robust affordability checks. I think better communication and customer education around the clear consequences of fraud, and that this kind of activity is a criminal offence and can have serious consequences. So I think there's some things that we can do there with engaging more effectively with our customers, with consumers, for them to understand that just because it's a big corporate company and you're not giving them the correct information about your earnings or your personal situation because you think it's gonna be okay, it's not really a problem, it will have a consequence. So there's definitely some work that we can do there. I think when it comes to false documentation, that's a technical challenge. Obviously AI is certainly turbo boosting threat actors' abilities on that front, but yeah, that is balanced by and mitigated by a multi-layer sort of document authentication, e-chips, biometric liveness checks, device fingerprinting, as well as sort of real-time risk scoring as well. So there are some things that we can do, but yeah, they are absolutely our challenges, and we do need to take steps to tackle them.
In the CIFAS report, I think it was a 76% rise in account takeover. So Steve A, I'm going to turn to you now. So from Equifax's perspective, what are the vulnerabilities being exploited, and how can businesses better prevent against this type of attack?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think Ruth, to an extent, has already answered it, which is many of our clients are spending so much time, effort, money on front-end controls. We're actually changing the dial on where the fraudsters have to attack us from. And as per Stephen, we're seeing more use of Gen AI, the ability to use live bots, the ability to use chatbots to speak to various companies. And we're actually seeing that kind of increase in account fraud across telcos, insurance, banks, finance companies. And it's almost a backhanded compliment from the fraudsters that we're getting such good front-end controls. We're making them having to find a new way to get in. So I think the key to actually preventing it is working with some of the great tools that are already applicable on the front end, but applying them to both the phone journey, live chat journey, midterm applications, and actually almost moving what you already know are great front-end controls into other areas as well. So for example, putting device ID risk on things like live chats to go, have you got multiple people trying to take over accounts, but all coming from the same device? So there's lots of opportunities there, I think, to use the tools we know and we love well, but into the new areas the fraudsters are attacking us from to try and shift the dial once again.
Yeah. Would you say, Stephen, the key challenges organisations are facing in terms of keeping up fraud tactics? Are the current strategies proving effective in your view?
I think strategies do prove effective, but I think the key thing we're all very aware of is fraudsters can be a lot more dynamic than almost any company. They can change things overnight. They can attack us from a different area overnight. And for us to actually move the controls into those areas, to stop account takeover, to stop document fraud, for example, it's always going to take a company longer to move their controls. So it's simply a case of trying to be as dynamic as we can as industries, but also sharing data. And we talk about CIFAS data. It's great data to use. There's a great roadmap for CIFAS. It's what's the additional opportunities there, working with the clients to go, actually, the fraud is less front end now. It may be happening further down the line, and actually making sure you're utilizing that great fraud data you already have access to at other points. So, for example, quite often you'll see a named driver added to an insurance policy, or a telephone number or address changed on a different journey. Are we still checking those against the great fraud consortium data that we've got to go, actually, we know this account was perfectly okay for the first 3 or 4 years, it's suddenly become bad, and using that great data that we're already sharing across multiple industries to actually make sure that that data hasn't gone bad at some point.
So it sounds like the data's there. it's a question of how you use it across the customer journeys. Do you go back to what you've seen before and connect the dots?
I think very much so, and I think there's always the point we can share more data, and I think it's a very, very strong point that we should all consider. What more fraud data can we put into the CIFAS pot and share across industries?
I think I'd add, I think one needs to be careful there. Data in of itself isn't the solution. It's how you then interpret and manage that data. And certainly, I think, the message I'm hearing is that they're, in terms of, are we keeping pace with the evolving tactics? Where there are organisations that are deploying AI-driven analytics and layered controls are having much more success than those that are perhaps still largely rules-based and are reacting to things after the fact. And I think there are real challenges around legacy systems and therefore things being in silos, which obviously is slowing response times down. I mean, fraudsters, are iterating much faster than us. So yeah, there's more that needs to be done on that sort of how you manage that data more effectively. It needs to be more predictive. We need to, as you say, Steve, we need to be more adaptive. Real-time risk management needs to be embedded across that sort of customer cycle, I think.
Absolutely agreed. And often when you look at clients, they've got great analytics in certain areas, but it's making sure you spread those across to fraud. And often you'll see some really, really good systems, but applying them into the fraud controls. And I think we all know as fraud managers, I know many of our attendees today will feel the pain that sometimes fraud isn't the first thing that people pay for. It's not seen as making money, so there's not a return on investment necessarily, but it's making sure we do spend the money to make sure we have the right controls in place.
It's a nice segue, actually. And we should, and I think we do think about fraud as a collective problem. We often talk about collaboration is a term that you hear very frequently. I wanted to dig into that collaboration concept because for me, you have an internal aspect of collaboration. The term FRAML, so obviously the fraud prevention, the AML teams coming together. So you've got removing internal silos within a business. You've got collaboration across an industry sector. But then you need cross-sector collaboration too, because fraud can start in one place and finish in another. Steve, I thought perhaps you could talk to the collaboration from an internal silos point of view.
I think that's very true. What you have is certainly teams that work on different areas, and quite often actually team A may not know the data team B has, for example. Very much to Stephen's point, it's making sure that data is spread across. I like rules-based, I like analytics. I think they complement each other very strongly. So you need to have an element of both, and you need to make sure you have those controls across multiple areas. And even often within a larger company, you may not know that another department is capturing other data. So it's making sure that the data estate all feeds into the counter fraud, and data shouldn't be shared unless it's really useful to do for fraud prevention. It has to have clear fraud flags on it. But if you see that, let's get that into the ecosystem. Let's not keep it to ourselves, and let's make sure that the wider consortium share from it.
Absolutely. And Ruth, in terms of cross-industry collaboration, what is UK Finance involved in, and are you seeing good practice out there?
Yeah, I think there is, as I said before, I think there's a real willingness to work together, and I'm really proud to work in a sector that is so passionate about fraud prevention and detection, and I'm pleased to say that's been the case in a number of roles I've been in now, particularly as being a trade association. We are there to represent our members' views, so we're heavily reliant on our members listening to members and understanding their challenges, and then reflecting those to government and others, and making sure that we can convene not just members but other parties, so law enforcement partners such as sort of CIFAS, CDA, etc., and other industry participants, to make sure that we are maximising the opportunity of both the experience and expertise that we have, but also data. So yes, there are some really good examples of great collaboration going on. I think the concern is that they are small pockets of tactical activity generally and aren't being scaled. And so that's where the biggest vulnerability is, that I think it's very easy to talk very loudly about those sort of, those pockets of good activity. But again, the data is indicating that we're not having an impact on the fraud problem. So clearly we're not going far enough. We're really hopeful that, and been working incredibly closely with the Home Office to be really bold in the next fraud strategy that's due to be published at the end of the year, to really implement measures that are focused on the preventative side. It's so important because we're continuing to inadvertently line the pockets of criminals and worse, funding very, very serious and organised criminality across the globe by not doing enough. And again, I mentioned earlier the role of systems leadership, and I think that government has an incredibly strong role to play there in making sure that we are joined up and that incentives or encouragement is provided in the sectors that are inadvertently facilitating the prevalence of particularly online fraud and the social engineering of individuals to part with their money. So a lot more is needed there. But we're making good tracks. We're doing everything we can, but we need everyone to play their part reciprocally in helping to solve the problem rather than closing their ears to it.
And Steve D, from CIFAS's point of view, looking at, I guess, cross-sector collaboration, because instances of fraud can begin in social media platforms and in places wholly distinct from where they end up, which is obviously someone's bank account being drained. So what have you seen in terms of collaboration?
We've really good examples of that, where individuals will use identity fraud to create legends and then use those identities to build sort of credibility, and then actually carry out their fraud in an entirely separate sector. So when they start out in banking and in credit cards and end up in asset finance. So yeah, that cross-sector collaboration is absolutely key. Obviously, CIFAS is an exemplar of that activity. We're working with multiple sectors, sharing our data. I agree with Ruth. There are some really good pockets of activity. We're starting to work, and I know Meta have been working with a number of the banks. We're looking to share some of that fraud attribute data, and there's some interesting sort of exploratory sort of pilots on that front as well. But they are limited, and they're not with everybody, and there needs to be a significant change around sort of how we do that. API-based data exchanges has got to become the norm. We need to think about standardizing our fraud typologies, because even within sectors, there's often arguments and debates about what do we mean by particular fraud types. And I was involved heavily when I was at the Insurance Fraud Bureau with setting up a sort of an agreed fraud typology schema, so that we could at least all agree when we talk about a particular type of fraud, we're talking about the same thing. I think also Ruth makes a good point about policy and leadership here. For too long, organisations have been saying we need to do more to share data, we need to do more to share data. The legislative frameworks exist for this now. The ICO made that very clear. They issued advice not so long ago around, preventing people sharing data to prevent people from becoming victims of scams is allowed and it's entirely lawful. But there still needs to be more done from a leadership point of view. And there's some good stuff coming along down the track. There's been recent legislation that's introduced, sort of an emphasis on sharing and being more proactive in that approach as well. So frameworks to ease the lawful sharing of data, great, but the leadership to actually drive to say you are allowed to do these things, you can actually get out there and do it, and making sure that we are getting better engagement with social media, where an awful lot of this activity, that's where it originates. So doing more on that front, getting the data that those guys, and as I say, we are now engaged. We're having conversations with particularly with Meta about how we can do that. So yeah, we are making progress, but there's still a lot to be done.
With that collaboration cross-sector, Stephen D, I assume we need a sense of collective responsibility too, because obviously, you know, the victim and, you know, the financial service providers are, you know, that is the byproduct of, you know, laxity in social media. So I guess, can collaboration foster a sense of shared responsibility?
I certainly, with the people that we speak to, are absolutely passionate about making this work and trying to do more. So I think the more there is that we create that conversation, and the more that we create that environment, then that, you know, the further up that will go in terms of the, you know, seniority of leadership within different industries and within different organisations, as well as the lead that we get from policymakers in government.
Okay, excellent. Just to remind everyone, to still feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A. I just wanted to talk about one more thing before we switch into that section. Talk about multi-layered approaches to fraud prevention. You know, the sort of the layers in the onion type metaphor. Stephen A, if I'm a company listening to this, how do I actually deploy that? How do I actually make that a reality for my business? What advice would you give?
I think the key really is to do regular reviews of the tools that are being used, the systems that are being used, and to do effectively fraud perimeter checks. And quite often what we do is we implement a tool, we use that tool for a period of time. But what we need to do is maybe once every 6 months come back to it and go, are there any tools that are missing? Because normally it takes a really good holistic set of tools to block all aspects of a fraud that's coming in. So making sure you have device elements, you have fraud consortium elements, you have biometrics or other similar verifications, to make sure you're doing your standard KYCs and identity checks, and making sure that not only are you doing a regular assessment of the rules themselves, but also of the tools, the quality of the tools, and the outcomes on them, to make sure that at all times you're trying to reduce the fraud, but equally, by keeping your finger on the pulse, quite often you can reduce customer friction by upgrading to the newest tool, which means that you get trust scores. You get something that indicates actually you can trust this customer and potentially even ask them less questions. So with a really good onboarding control, it gets that best of both worlds. It's reducing the customer friction, but also stopping the fraud at the same time. So I think those fraud perimeters are really important. And it is a case of just remembering to go back and just recheck where you are. What have you done so far? Where are the gaps? Where are the fraudsters attacking from now? Is there a really easy win to go and stop the current fraud trends, and effectively keeping the finger on the pulse of what the fraudsters are doing? But more widely than that, attending webinars, attending consortiums, and actually hearing what your peers are saying. And quite often, I go to many webinars and you get a really good reassurance that what everybody else is saying is the same as me. But equally speaking, I'll often learn something new and go, I thought I knew where this fraud was happening. And maybe one of my competitors will say, I saw something new last week. And what you can do is share between competitors, not just at a data level, at the trend level, at the best practice level, to see what you can actually do just to make sure that your competitor didn't shut one door last week and they've come in your front door. Working together as an industry to make sure controls align, I think it's really important to stop fraud.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Do we have any other questions from the audience that we wanted to cover now? I've got one just dropped up in front of me. So this question for Stephen D. Since what point has the 1000% increase been seen in fraud initiated from SIM swaps? Is that the year-on-year increase?
Yes, so we had relatively low volume of SIM swaps being reported in 2023, and there was a significant uptick in that monitoring. It's worth saying that it's a small number of members that are filing additional cases. So I think it's probably showing a truer scale of the problem rather than the activity is suddenly ramped up. Certainly that's the impression when one looks at action fraud reporting and the analysis done by the NCA and the NFIB. They're seeing an increase, a steady increase in SIM swap activity, and certainly talking to Meta and some of the telco companies, that's a significant concern for them.
Another question for Stephen A. Given the widespread availability of generative AI, what proactive steps can organizations take not only detect but also disrupt the creation, distribution of AI generated fraudulent content? Steve A, you might be muted.
Apologies, yes. I think there's some really good tools for stopping AI generated content. I think document checks are actually really, really good at the moment. What we see particularly with AI generated documents is normally they look too good to be true, or they are templates that are being used across multiple industries. I've seen examples of literally one template that pretends to be an insurer in the morning, a bank in the afternoon, and a utility company the next day. So actually, I think working with some really good document tools, actually it's really easy to spot the AI generated because you don't have the traditional flaws in the document that's been printed. You don't have the correct metadata in the document, and you can do that trend analysis to go, have we seen this template before? And it is then a case, as I think Ruth has said already, which is backtracking through the process to work out who's creating it and making sure you are working with the right police forces where people are identified to stop it at source as well. Now, it's often very, very hard to stop it at source, but I've seen a number of examples over the years where you could track it back through either a fraudulent document where you then track it into the original advert was on Meta, and then you can work with Meta to actually identify who the original person was. The fraudsters are clever, but they're not always. So quite often you look at a Meta advert and they will have their real telephone number on there, or they'll have their real bank account on there. So there will be something you can work with the police forces to actually work with them to identify where are the funds going, who was it that's taking all of these direct messages to set things up for other people. So probably 9 out of 10 investigations don't have that level of information, but when you do, you can get back to source and look at actually disrupting that creation, disrupt that distribution at source as well.
Thank you, Stephen A. I have a question for Ruth. Ruth, you spoke about the big increase in unauthorized card fraud. Are we seeing some classic use cases of this? And then what are the controls which are working to control the same being used by the banks?
So we are, card not present is primarily the largest driver of the unauthorized fraud that's happening. But as you'd expect, we're seeing sort of the trends and methodologies there ebbing and flowing. And ultimately, we don't see an awful lot in terms of abuses against faster payments, because the controls there are actually very, very good. And so the fraudsters are obviously having to try to interact with the weakest point in the process, and that is often the individual, I'm sorry to say. So what we're seeing an awful lot of is use of the one-time passcode and social engineering of individuals to provide their one-time passcodes when their details are being used online for a purchase, for example, but are being socially engineered into thinking that they're providing the passcode to approve a refund, for example, to their bank account. One of the challenges that we're having at the moment, and that we're working really closely with our members on, is that there are pockets of areas of the industry which treat that type of fraud as authorized because a one-time password has been provided. There's other areas of industry that believe that's unauthorized on the basis that that it wasn't the individual that was authorizing the payment, and certainly not knowing what the payment was actually for. So one of the pieces of work that we're doing at the moment is trying to make sure we can get alignment across our industry to try to tackle the problem, and also bring in the schemes into that, because at the moment they are not fully cited on the extent of card fraud, on the basis that there is this sort of lack of consistency around the way it's being dealt with. So that's a real priority for one of our cross-sector working groups at the moment. But there are such an array of tools and controls and measures being put in place. Obviously, we operate a very free market, and members have got multiple different sort of systems and a multi-layered approach to fighting fraud, of course, and indeed have regulatory responsibilities to do so. But it's really a case of actually being responsive, I think, as others have said today, to the changing tactics. And again, data is absolutely the key to that. And one thing that we're not very good at, I think, collectively, is we have a whole host of data. We are enjoying a state where we have more data than we know what to do with. We're just not leveraging it. And if we leveraged it to our advantage in a collective way, then we would be able to see some of these emerging threats bubbling up under the surface. I feel strongly we would have seen, had we had the ability to and brought our data together sooner, we would have had the ability to see APP fraud bubbling up 20 years ago under the surface. But I don't believe we did spot that. And so now it seemed to be, such a harm to individuals. And again, we can't forget that there are, individuals at the end of this whose lives are absolutely devastated by this. I think we've certainly heard from law enforcement partners in City of London Police that they can attribute 300 suicides last year to a fraud event, which is absolutely devastating. So, I don't think we've ever had a greater impetus to do something about this. I know that other sort of industry counterparts are tired of talking about greater data and intelligence sharing. But I think now is the time to realise that we can't keep doing the same and expect a different response. We need to go harder and faster, and we really need a fraud strategy that is more radical to make a dent in the problem.
Can I just come in on that, the point there that Ruth said about awash with data, or words to that effect? I might be paraphrasing Ruth, apologies if I am. But I think that's where, with the emergence of AI, we talk a lot about AI and how it's enabling the fraudster, giving them all these tools in order to try and overcome our defences. I think there's an awful lot of really good work going on as well, and I think it's a positive sign around how AI and AI-driven data analytics is going to help us to tackle some of these problems, to spot some of these things sooner, because there is such an enormous amount of data. It's how you sort of carve that up and how you look at that in a way. And also there's some really interesting work going on around organisations that are developing AI bots that are harvesting data directly from the scammers, capturing IP addresses, capturing bank account details of where the scammers want money to be sent. And that obviously creates lots of opportunity around tackling the problem that way. So I think once we have, it can seem very pessimistic in terms of the scale of the problem and obviously the challenges we face. It is just worth remembering that there is light as well in terms of how AI technologies can enable us to do much better.
I might add, I think cross-sector there is so important. I remember a case probably from a decade ago where a bank had seen multiple transactions all applying for insurance on the one account, and they were online transactions, so the bank saw them as online. We'd actually spotted the fraud, we'd refunded the payments, but we refunded them as standard as offline. So when the bank reconciled them, they hadn't realised they'd had the money back, and when they contacted me, they'd assumed it was money laundering, thinking the money was going maybe to a different bank account or being cashed out. And when we actually spoke to them and had a really good education session, bi-directionally, they learned stuff about me, and I was able to share things and they were able to share things with me as well. They were able to say, actually, it wasn't money laundering, it was ghost broking, and we had already spotted it and refunded it. Maybe we could have spotted it earlier and stopped the transaction, but we'd seen it within 24 hours and got the money back to them. But because they weren't reconciling their online and offline payments, they hadn't realised that, and they jumped to a very fair assumption. And actually, that cross-industry collaboration meant we both came off better and understood what both parties were doing.
Great example. A question for Stephen D. Are there particularly good resources for staff training to raise awareness in email fraud that you would recommend? A short video, perhaps.
Well, I can't put my finger on a particular example, but what I can say, and this feels like a blatant pitch, so apologies for that, but obviously CIFAS have a learning academy that has a broad range of fraud related topics. So if you're looking for staff training, then get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with the learning academy team, and we'll be more than happy to discuss requirements.
Okay,
I'll say no more than that.
No, fair enough, fair enough. Stephen A, there's a follow-on question, I think, from an answer you gave earlier. Can any specific examples of detection stop at source be shared? It's difficult from the hypothetical discussion to imagine it in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a case from many a moon ago and some very similar more recent ones where we have had fraudsters hitting and we could trace it back either to a Facebook page or to somewhere else. I remember a particular one who was calling himself Frank F&B Insurance Brokers, but when you looked at it, he was using the Frankie and Benny's logo, and you could actually investigate it through that. We had the genuine name. The person had actually taken an insurance policy out for themselves in their own name, but using the telephone number that they'd used for all of the victims as well. So we could actually trace that back, and there's been a number of cases over the years where we've worked with City of London Police, various areas in the City of London, to get that data, to work with them, and they finally ended up, quite often, it takes a little while to put the packs together, but you then end up in court with somebody, and I think I've been probably involved in 6 or 7 cases where not only could you identify who it was, but you could actually end up in court with them, make sure it was fully investigated and make sure at the end of the day they were convicted for either something under the Fraud Act or something similar. So actually I think working with particularly the industry arenas and working it back, it's definitely able to stop it at source. It isn't always quick, but you do have some brilliant successes that you can really, really celebrate together, I think.
Okay. Another question for you, Stephen A. Will you be facilitating any sector-specific or cross-sector events, roundtables and the like? Yeah,
very much. We're proactively organising some at the moment. Watch this space. We're just finalising dates, and then we'll let each industry know. I think there's highly likely to be telco, insurance, bank roundtable event, but watch this space. We will get information out as soon as it's finalised at our end.
Thank you. Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to give each of our guests an opportunity just to provide one key takeaway for our audience today from their respective points of view. So, yeah, turning to you, Ruth, what would you like to leave us with?
Very short and sweet. Data is king.
Data is king. Thank you. Stephen D.
Echoing what Ruth has said, I think fraud's evolving faster than individual organisations can respond. So we have to collaborate. We need to do that, and we need to innovate at speed.
Excellent. And Stephen A.
I think I probably echo both of those. Fraud perimeter workshops regularly, collaborating with industry groups as well as your peers, as well as other industries. Share best practice, share trends, share fraud data where you're allowed, and work together.
Very nice too. So yeah, lovely way to finish. So we're in it together effectively. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy days to join us today. The UK Finance Annual Fraud Report and the CIFAS Fraudscape report will be available as links to anyone who registered to the webinar. We'll email those to you as a follow-up. And as Stephen A said, Equifax run regular fraud perimeter workshops where we help our clients to make sure that they do have a robust and dynamic approach to managing this ever-changing threat. So thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.